Hello and welcome back to TriggerSmart. As many of you have already heard, Dan Flood was removed from the TPUSA site. I have some more details, mostly around the history of Charlie's security team and some of the behind the scenes that some of you may not know. I found it very interesting. I did a very, very deep dive into this, and it does include Brian Harpole and Dan Flood. So the first thing I'm going to point out here, just like other people already have, is just you go to the website, you go to tpusa.com, and they have their board of directors and they have their staff. Well, Dan Flood used to be under the executives. He used to be in this list here. And actually, I think there's more people here right now than there were even yesterday. Interesting, which is more proof they might just be simply updating this stuff. But he was with TPUSA for a very long period of time, and he still might be, and he was removed. But here's what's interesting. Some people said that maybe he's just, they're moving him to another section or he got a different title or something similar. Well, let's look at this. If I type in, let's see, Andrew Shaffer. Andrew Shaffer. That's an interesting last name. Andrew Shaffer. And this goes to his biography. And basically, every single one of these executives, like Frank Carney, let's search for Frank Carney. Frank Carney. Well, see if I can type there. Frank Carney. And he has his biography. He has a page. So all of them have a page that's just kind of their, whatever their role is at TPUSA, they just happen to have a role that goes with it, and a page and a biography. And let's do one more just to really drive the point home. Marina Minus. And again, you have her biography page pops up. Now let's search for Dan Flood. He was definitely 100% there previously. Dan Flood. We just get this Seattle mayor calls Christian worship article. And even in this article, I'm not sure why this even popped up, but if you search for Dan Flood on the page, it doesn't exist. So Dan Flood is not listed in here at all. Dan Bongino is, right? So I found it very interesting that on this executive's page, if he is being moved to a different position or has a different title, they have also removed or pulled down his biography page. Very interesting. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, it is this gentleman right here. This is Dan Flood, and he was the gentleman who was in black and had the black sunglasses behind Charlie. He's also the one that physically pulled him off of his chair and brought him to the ground. And he has been with TPUSA and leading this thing for a long time. But what's interesting is a lot of people don't realize that the security team was a mixed team. So Brian Harpole came out and he said that, hey, we're integrity security team, and I have like the top guys, and we came in and we've been doing this stuff for a while. Well, there's a lot more details to it and kind of some controversial stuff too. All right, so we're going to dig into this, and this is Greg Shaffer. This was Charlie's head of security previously for like 15 years, I believe. And he, obviously during his tenure, Charlie was still alive, and then Charlie was handed off to the next team. And like I said, I'm going to talk about some of the stuff that was happening behind the scenes at TPUSA. A little bit of funny business, maybe. So let's hear what he has to say first, and then we'll jump into that.
Greg, thank you so much for joining us as we unpack this tragedy. Now, there is actually a press conference right now in Utah about the shooting. Walk us through what's the latest in that presser. What do we know so far?
Well, they're saying, like you just said, Kash Patel announced that they have a suspect in custody. They also have some information that they gleaned from CCTVs on campus that could also help in the investigation. And the governor of Utah did go on national news and state that and remind everybody that Utah does have the death penalty. So, it's a tragic day for Utah, a tragic day for America. And, I don't know if you knew this or not, but I was actually the security director for Turning Point USA and for Charlie Kirk Security for 7 years, from 2015 to 2022.
And Greg, on that note, digging into that, what do these events typically entail security-wise?
Yeah, Charlie Kirk, is a private citizen, and Turning Point USA is a private company. So they don't get the police protection or the protection of the federal government from the Secret Service or Homeland Security or FBI and like that. All the security for Turning Point USA and for Charlie Kirk is paid for by that organization. So, security is a very expensive thing to have, especially when it's full time.
Now that's going to become very important here. the fact that security is very expensive. And that may have been part of the reason why they shifted security. And another thing here, correction, he said 7 years, it wasn't 15, but clearly a long period of time. And he had his own company as well, just like Brian Harpole. And it's very interesting that he seems very calm here. I think there might be a little bit of animosity towards the Integrity company, but the reason why is from my research and what I've seen so far, it sounds like Brian Harpole used to work for this guy with his company, and then Brian Harpole went out and started his own company, and then things went from there.
And what they do in these, prove me wrong campus visits is, they'll open up to the entire campus. As you can see from the videos, it's a very open venue. He usually sits under a tent, and he will have a 5-man detail doing close perimeter security for him.
He said 5-man is typical. They actually had 12 with Brian Harpole and Integrity Security. And Brian Harpole also, in one interview, he kind of mentioned 13, a 13th guy. And I've been trying to dig further into that and see what he meant by that, but it's kind of strange.
If you look at some of the videos, you can see 2 large gentlemen in front of the stage. You always had an individual, who used to work for me, on Charlie's right-hand shoulder, and then you had another 2 individuals probably behind that tent. So you had a close perimeter security of about 5 personnel. That is about all that he would travel with for these events, and then they would also work with and coordinate with the campus police. Now, not to disparage campus police officers, but most college campuses have pretty poor security and poor police forces that are undermanned and underfunded.
And undertrained. So that's a really good point that he made. These, even if Brian Harpole had delegated out watching the roof and securing the rest of the campus to the local police, Orem Police, or UVU, or whoever it may have been, they're not really trained for that type of stuff. They're not high-level operatives and stuff like Harpole's team are. So think of like a flashlight cop, basically, and you're putting them in place to, be in charge of guarding the roof and doing security and all that kind of stuff for a high-level political figure. I just think it was a bad match, and obviously we already know that Integrity dropped the ball on their end by not verifying that the roof was clear.
I did hear a report that the campus police said they had 6 officers on duty. I'm assuming most of those officers were doing crowd control and traffic control, not really there for security of Charlie Kirk. Again, security for Charlie himself was by his private security company. And then, it's hard to, when you're at these events, you get close in security, you try to cover your principal up close, but this shot came from somewhere like 200 yards away. That is almost impossible to defend against. Unless you have counter sniper teams and have an intense amount of manpower and money to back up that manpower.
I have to call bullshit on this. So he's saying you have to have a counter sniper team and immense amounts of manpower. That is false. You could have 1 or 2 people flying drones, and that would have covered the roof. They may not have been able to immediately taken out the threat, but they could have seen the threat. All they had to do was get on the radio and say, hey, we have someone on the roof, pull Charlie. And they just grab him and they're out of there, right? So I think that is an extreme for him to say, like, oh, they have to have a counter sniper force with, 17 guys and they have to be able to, like, watch the whole perimeter and control every little detail. That's not true. But, having eyes on the roofs in general probably would have covered it. Just like if you look at the Butler, Pennsylvania, Thomas Crooks. He was seen, there's cell phone footage that shows him up on the roof for a long period of time, moving around and getting in position. And you can clearly see him, and they can see him, and they're telling other officers and security guards that are around them, they're like, look, he's on the roof, he's moving, you can see him, he has a gun. And no one did anything about it.
Protecting somebody from 200 yards away is incredibly difficult, if not impossible.
And Greg, given that you've worked with Charlie Kirk, from your perspective, did he face more hostility than normal speakers would at universities?
It was always contentious, but that's he thrived on that. He would always make the announcement during these events. If you disagree with what I'm saying, you have front of the line privileges. He wanted to engage with those that disagree with him. He wanted to have that conversation to try to change their mind or for them to prove him wrong. Hence,
that's one of the things about Charlie that people appreciated the most is he wasn't afraid to talk to people who completely opposed him. people that downright despised him and hated everything he stood for and everything that he thought. But that also put him in a situation like maybe he got into with this assassination, where he pissed off enough people that eventually it caught up with him. Now, Brian Harpole, in his interview with Sean Ryan, pointed out that Charlie saw some of the issues, and the security team pointed out, like, this is not a good setup, and these gates and things, it's not a good, it's not necessarily easy to keep you safe in this situation. And he said that Charlie said, let's do it. Like, he was all for it. Now, this could be his faith. I know a lot of people like that. They have a super strong faith, and they'll do literally anything and not care. They don't even care if they die. They're just like, hey, it's what I'm supposed to do. If it's what God wants me to do, I'm going to go do it. If they kill me during it, then I'll just be with my maker sooner. That could have been part of his mentality, but that could also be why all of this happened. Now, that was Greg Shaffer. He had the previous security company. All right, so now let's look at the timeline for Charlie Kirk security providers. 2015 to 2022, Shaffer Security Group, and that's the gentleman we just saw, Greg Shaffer. He was personal security for Charlie Kirk, and he was a former FBI agent, led a team of about 5 protectors at each event. And again, this latest event that he got assassinated at had 12 or 13, typically guarding against close-range threats, protesters rushing the stage, etc. Dan Flood and Brian Harpole were part of this detail under Shaffer's leadership during those years. Now, that's really important. So Dan Flood is the gentleman who was behind Charlie. He's the one who is now missing from the TPUSA site. Then we have Brian Harpole, and he owns the security company and was on the ground with that team and was the one who was giving first aid to Charlie. He's the one that interviewed on the Sean Ryan show. Both of them were under Greg Shaffer's detail. So it's interesting because Dan Flood works directly for TPUSA, and he was like head of their security and some other divisions actually as well, security overall, including, I believe, cybersecurity. And then Brian Harpole worked for that detail, and he started his own company. So SSG remained Kirk's security provider until 2022. Now, in late 2022, it transitioned to Rockhouse Integrity, and that is Brian Harpole's. In 2022, 2 key members of Shaffer's team, Dan Flood and Brian Harpole, left Shaffer Security Group and effectively took over the TPUSA security contract. Now, according to this, it seems as though Dan Flood was on Shaffer's team. He didn't work for TPUSA yet at that time. And then you have Brian Harpole, who was a team member. They both left together and started their own security contract. Harpole launched a new Texas-based firm called Rockhouse Integrity Group, doing business as Integrity Security Solutions around that time. TPUSA dropped SSG services. Shaffer has not been under contract with TPUSA since 2022, and they switched to Harpole's company for Charlie Kirk's events. Shaffer later bitterly described this as a betrayal, saying Flood and Harpole stabbed him in the back by undercutting his firm to snatch the TPUSA contract. So again, the TPUSA was wanting to pay less money. So Brian Harpole and Dan Flood swooped in, offering a contract with less cost. Brian had worked for Shaffer for 7 years, and Dan Flood was likewise a close associate, which compounded Shaffer's sense of betrayal. So he had 2 of his main guys underneath him who had been working security with him for Charlie for quite some time, and they both went behind his back, created their own company, and stole the contract. By early 2023, Integrity Security Rockhouse was the primary security for Kirk's tour events, with Dan Flood now in a prominent in-house role at TPUSA. So all of that is very interesting. So there was some internal struggle between different security assets, and you had one that was there for 7 years, and then 2 of his guys undercut him, started their own company, and now they are basically running things. And they switched in 2022. So clearly they kept him safe for a couple of years. Now, a lot of people are saying that the security team was in on it and maybe they took him out for some reason. That's not to say that things couldn't have happened later. Maybe they got paid off by somebody or something negative happened or they were jealous or something like that. Who knows, right? That's all just speculation. But it's very clear that on TPUSA side and the security team side, there was definitely some struggle. And here's the roles of key individuals. Dan Flood, TPUSA Security Chief. He's a former U.S. Marine who specialized in counterterrorism. He encountered Charlie Kirk while working in executive protection in 2016, and he helped guard Kirk at events. Before transitioning into full-time security, Flood had an unusual career detour. He spent 14 years as an executive in the animal health industry, honing management skills. Around late 2022, Flood left Shaffer's firm and was brought on staff at TPUSA as its head of security. Now, my question would be, how come Greg Shaffer, who had been protecting Charlie and had his own company and had been doing that for 7 years, why wasn't he brought on full-time? That's interesting. And he was a full-time hire rather than a contractor. His initial title was Chief Asset Management Officer, overseeing TPUSA's asset management, distribution, and risk mitigation efforts. Flood is described as Kirk's personal security lead, immediately by Kirk's side at events. So my question would be, why wasn't he interviewed instead of Brian Harpole? He is directly with TPUSA. He works directly for them. And he was the security lead in charge of all this. And he was part of the mixed team on the ground with Integrity Security Solutions. That's an interesting question. Why is Dan Flood not taking interviews, and why is he now off of the TPUSA site? And Brian Harpole is doing interviews and taking the fall. Now, many of you know who Brian Harpole is, but we'll do a quick overview. Private security contractor, former Texas officer with 14 years of law enforcement experience. After leaving the police in 2008, he entered the private security field. In 2022, he founded Integrity Security Solutions, also known as Rockhouse Integrity Group, based in Lantana, Texas. Harpole's company specializes in global protection and executive protection. The firm was contracted by TPUSA to secure Kirk's events starting in 2023. Now, that also goes against the 2022 switch that everything else is saying too. These are multiple sources. This, obviously, I'm using ChatGPT here, but this pulled from several sources doing deep research. So there's some kind of like iffy numbers and stuff going on, but it's around 2022, 2023 when things switched over. Harpole is a close friend of Dan Flood. Shaffer noted the two were best friends in his team. As a security team leader, Harpole typically ran the advanced planning and on-site tactical operations for Kirk's appearances. Now remember that Dan Flood was said to be more of like the business type, and he was focusing more on that stuff, doing management in the vet field or whatever that was. And Harpole was kind of running the tactical operations. At the 2025 Utah event, Harpole was on the ground security chief heading the private detail, with Flood as the TPUSA in-house security director working alongside him. So it sounds like in this case, Flood let Harpole take the lead. And then, of course, we quickly talked about Greg Shaffer, former security director. He is a former FBI tactical agent who founded Shaffer Security Group in Dallas, Texas. He was director of security for TPUSA and personal bodyguard lead for Charlie Kirk from 2015 until the end of 2022. Under Shaffer, Kirk's protective detail was small, often only 5 people. And remember that this event that he got shot at, there was 12 people, possibly 13, and focused on immediate threats, as the time and attack from a long-range sniper was not anticipated. After being ousted from the TPUSA contract, Shaffer did not participate in Kirk's events. In the aftermath of the assassination, Shaffer became an outspoken critic of the security lapses that occurred. Of course he did. They turned their back on him, and they undercut him and stole his contract, basically, after working for him for 7 years. He has publicly maintained that had his team still been in charge, things might have been different, though he admitted that even his prior details never had the manpower to post rooftop snipers or handle a distant active shooter scenario without law enforcement help. So again, even with a different person with Greg Shaffer, he's saying he still would have needed, local police, Orem police, or UVU. But either way, again, a drone, which you can get permission at, according to their own documentation at UVU, a drone would have helped significantly that day. All right, so now let's talk about security lapses and security setup. The event set up on September 10th, 2025. Charlie Kirk's speaking event at Utah Valley University was held outdoors in a central open courtyard, which was a huge mistake to start with. The venue was surrounded by multi-story campus buildings, second huge mistake, providing elevated vantage points for the crowd. Harpole's security had spent weeks mapping out the site. He said 2 weeks. Harpole was immediately uneasy about the location, calling it horrible from a tactical perspective, which is very true. An open courtyard flanked 180 degrees by high ground that could be exploited by a shooter. Yet he still went along with it. He would have preferred an indoor venue or at least an amphitheater with controlled entry. And remember, too, that there was no metal detectors. They weren't even checking tickets for this event, which I thought was very strange. UVU officials later claimed it was Kirk's team who requested the central outdoor space. Notably, Kirk favored open, unticketed events with minimal screening. Charlie liked it, no gates, regular people showed up. And that is what we've been hearing, right? Charlie has, he likes the adversity. He likes the challenge. And this is very, very important here. Harpole said, acknowledging that Kirk knowingly accepted the security risks to avoid barriers for his audience. So he was willing to die for what he believed in. Known rooftop risks ignored. Days before the event, Harpole was warned about student organizers that there was an overlook over the courtyard. This immediately raised a red flag. Now, this location is not where the shot came from. This was a separate one. Harpole texted UVU Police Chief Long about the issue, asked if campus police could secure the roofs and allow Harpole to station one of his guys up there. He said, "I got you covered." In reality, however, no officer was ever posted on the roof from which the shot was later fired. Now, I think this is a point where a lot of people are kind of confused too. So the texts, I believe, from what I've seen so far, were covering directly behind Charlie up on that building. And if you look at the video, you'll see that basically no one was up there. I think that Adam Bartholomew was one of the few people that was actually above Charlie. And then you have the spot he was shot from was not covered by anyone. In fact, none of those roofs were even being looked at. And it says this rooftop oversight proved fatal. On the day of the event, that very spot became the sniper's perch. Security presence and limitations. By the afternoon of September 10th, they were expecting about 600 people. They ended up with over 3,000. The security arrangements were relatively light given the crowd size. I find that interesting because typically he would only have a 5-guy detail under Greg Shaffer, and he had 12 or 13 for 3,000 people. UVU had 8 campus police officers on duty, 6 in uniform and 2 plain clothes. That's interesting. 2 plainclothes officers. I wonder what they were doing and where they were at and what their role was in all this. And did not employ metal detectors or bag checks. Harpole's private detail security consisted of 13 guards he brought from Rockhouse Integrity Group. Okay, now there again, we're seeing inconsistencies. He said he brought 12 in the Sean Ryan interview. And then I believe he said there may have been like a 13th in the Paramount Tactical interview. And now you have articles saying 13 guards and some saying 12 guards. So who was this 13th person and what were they doing? Interesting. These were plainclothes security professionals scattered throughout the venue. Additionally, Dan Flood was on site in a leadership role. Flood, as TPUSA's in-house security chief, acted as additional security lead. So they had 2 security leads, and they still couldn't get it done. Despite these known threats, certain measures were constrained. Harpole's team had drone surveillance capability to monitor high vantage points, but UVU rules prohibited private drones over campus without permission, which was not granted. Now, again, I've talked about this before, and I showed their documentation. They could have easily put in documentation over those 2 weeks they were there to get permission for that day. There were other drones up in the air. There's tons of drone footage of that day. So there was no excuse for them to not have it. Likewise, Harpole had asked UVU to close off at least a pedestrian walkway above the courtyard, which did happen. Fearing objects could be thrown down. Beyond that, general perimeter security was porous. No support from city police or sheriff's officers was requested by UVU. So UVU also has a role in this. Even though Orem PD had drones and backup units available nearby, Harpole later learned that UVU never asked for outside help at all. They weren't there, they hadn't been asked, and we can't request them. I don't have the authority, he said. Anyone has the authority to ask a question. He didn't ask. And then this has the play-by-play of the assassination. Attack and immediate response. Just minutes after Charlie Kirk began his remarks, around 20 minutes into the event, a single gunshot cracked across the courtyard. A single sniper on the roof of the Losi Center had fired a rifle. Now, this is the FBI official narrative. The bullet struck Kirk on the left side of his neck, causing massive trauma. In that instant, Brian Harpole and Dan Flood reacted instinctively. Both men leaped onto Kirk from either side, attempting to cover him and prevent any follow-up shots. Unlike Brian Harpole said in his interview, they weren't protecting Charlie. They were basically just trying to hide him at that point because they didn't have the body armor or anything to stop those shots. It just would have went through them and hit Charlie still. Attendees recalled a split second of confusion as Kirk fell to the ground, bleeding profusely. Harpole heard the distinct crack of the rifle, followed by the thump of the bullet hitting Kirk. And many people had described this sound like a firework, and he knew immediately what happened. As the crowd processed the shock, Harpole and Flood were already on top of Kirk behind the stage, and Harpole pressed his hands over the wound on Kirk's neck to slow the bleeding. He also said the blood was gushing out despite his efforts, and he got some blood on his mouth and he could taste it. Within seconds, Harpole's team feared the shooter might fire again, or that there could be multiple shooters. So Harpole shouted to his team to evacuate Kirk. Now, this is where a lot of people got very angry because they felt that they did not stabilize Charlie Kirk before moving him. And then you had Paramount Tactical saying, Paramount Tactical and Sean Ryan both agree that you don't stand in a position where someone was shooting at. You want to get off the X and you want to move on and that kind of stuff. So, if it's much different if an EMT comes up to a car accident and they have time to just sit there and stabilize the person, and the car's not on fire, it's not going to blow up, and there's no other immediate danger. It's a lot different than being fired on in a battle zone or on the streets, even like in a gang fight or something. You don't stay in the spot where bullets were just hitting. You get the hell out of the way, but they still need to stabilize them. So it's a very difficult situation for anyone. They decided not to wait for paramedics on scene. Instead, Kirk's bodyguards scooped him up and rushed him into a security SUV. Dan Flood and other team members loaded Kirk into the back seat and sped off to the nearest hospital in a high-speed emergency drive. Harpole stayed half inside the vehicle, applying pressure to Kirk's wound with bandages. He later recounted using 36 feet of gauze in an attempt to stop the hemorrhaging. Now, when I saw the pictures and video, which of course they all look like they're filmed through a potato, as Harsh would say, it's very interesting that I never saw a door open to the point where Harpole could hang out of the vehicle, but maybe this did happen. Kirk, a tall man, 6'5", was in such dire condition they couldn't even fully close the doors. Harpole had to hold on as they raced to Timpanogos Regional Hospital, just a few miles away. Upon arrival, Kirk was rushed into the ER. Harpole, drenched in blood, helped him into a gurney, and then he stood guard outside the trauma room, still hoping for a miracle. Now, I don't know how hospitals function, but is it normal for a hospital to allow a security team to just take over and do whatever they want and guard doors and that kind of stuff? I don't know. Tragically, the injury was unsurvivable. The bullet had fragmented. Now they're going into the full FBI story. Within a short time, surgeons pronounced him dead and said he died from the wound. Single sniper's bullet had effectively assassinated him in front of his audience. Now, he was only 31 years old. And now back on the timeline. Back on campus, the crowd and remaining security personnel were in chaos right after the shot. Harpole said there was a few guys that were still there, a few of his team. They were checking other people to see if they'd been shot, and they were kind of trying to secure the area. And I guess the local police tried to get his team to secure the crime scene, which we know didn't happen because one of the guys was able to walk in there and just grab an SD card. Students and attendees dropped to the ground or ran for cover. Some witnesses later expressed they had a weird feeling the setup was vulnerable just moments before the shot rang out. There was initially uncertainty about where the shot came from. They suspected high ground and tried to spot a shooter, but he was gone by the time they swept the rooftops. Within minutes, campus police initiated a lockdown and began searching for the shooter. The suspect had fled, but the next day, law enforcement apprehended 22-year-old Tyler James Robinson as the alleged gunman. Exactly 33 hours. Investigators say Robinson, who was not a UVU student, opposed Kirk's politics and had staked out the rooftop as a sniper position. There were reports from, definitely from one student, but possibly more than one, that they contacted the FBI, I believe, is what I've seen. And they said that they had seen someone on there the 2 weeks prior to Charlie being shot on the roof, and they reported it. I don't know what came of those reports, but that's the thing. He was arrested without incident about a day later after the shooting and was charged with aggravated murder. And we know there's supposed to be a court case happening in January. The area where Kirk fell became a crime scene. It was later turned into a makeshift memorial with flowers and flags by the students and supporters. And that, we all know that's very questionable. First of all, the whole crime scene not being treated like a crime scene. There were people going in and out of it and taking things. And then the fact that it was quickly paved over, and obviously it was not paved over to be a memorial. They said it was pre-scheduled. They didn't pre-schedule a memorial for Charlie Kirk before he was dead. So all very strange. Post-event fallout and public commentary. Greg Shaffer's critique and claims. Now, Greg Shaffer was the original protector of Charlie. In the wake of Kirk's assassination, former security director Greg Shaffer was outspoken about what went wrong. Absolutely, there were security failures. It left him exposed. Now, nothing happened during the time that he was protecting Charlie for 7 years with some of the same staff, including Dan Flood and Brian Harpole. Shaffer said, calling the lack of rooftop coverage and other gaps a fatal oversight. Now, he's saying it's an oversight, which is the same as saying that they messed up. He characterized the security setup on September 10th as egregious, so inadequate that a determined attacker was able to exploit it and kill Kirk. Some would say amateur. Shaffer's critique extended beyond the UVU. He pointed fingers at TPUSA's new security team as well. In interviews, Shaffer revealed that his firm had handled Kirk's protection for 7 years until 2022, but that Dan Flood and Brian Harpole replaced him after snatching the contract. Now, there we go again. There was some fighting behind the scenes. He described being blindsided by Flood and Harpole's departure, implying they leveraged insider knowledge to underbid or outmaneuver SSG. No falling out, just got stabbed in the back by some friends, Shaffer told a reporter. While mourning Kirk's death, Shaffer did not hide his frustration that his successors, in his view, failed to anticipate a sniper-type threat or secure the events adequately. Now, after President Trump's failed assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania, you would think that rooftops would be a priority. Shaffer's comments have fueled speculation about internal mistakes. He suggested that if his team were still in charge, more resources, like snipers, metal detectors, might have been used, though it's not certain if that would have occurred. So, I mean, this is where the follow-through comes in. Brian Harpole and Dan Flood did not follow through to make sure that the other resources were in place. And that is 100% their responsibility. So they definitely dropped the ball, and they are responsible for that. And as you saw, the Sean Ryan interview, I believe, got millions of views, but the Paramount Tactical one just has, 20,000 or 30,000 or something. And that's because people aren't buying it. And many of you already know Brian Harpole's response. It was basically that he was blaming UVU's police and Orum's police for dropping the ball and not covering what they said they would cover. Again, not taking any responsibility for what happened. And it's unfortunate because if Brian Harpole and Dan Flood had not underbid and taken over for Greg Shaffer, then Charlie might still be alive. Harpole's stance is that Charlie Kirk died doing what he loved, but avoidable errors by UVU magnified the danger. Now, he allowed that danger, and he allowed Charlie to still continue forward. He has been pressing UVU for answers, publicly asking why the police chief isn't taking accountability for the broken promise for rooftop security. And then, of course, you have all the different theories and stuff that are out there. Some promoting a narrative that Kirk was betrayed by his own security team and that they were Israeli security guards that were previously Israeli ex-special forces. Detractors scrutinized footage of security guards making hand gestures or moving just before the shot, which I believe Ian Carroll and some other people are still actually digging into that, while he's speculating that these were coordinated signals to a sniper. Harpole has emphatically denied all such allegations. In this interview, he addressed these rumors point by point. No, his team does not use military hand signals for communication in the field. The atmosphere has been so charged that TPUSA and security staff largely stayed silent publicly for weeks, actually months, partly to avoid fielding speculation. By refuting these claims on a reputable platform, Harpole aimed to shut down the false narratives. Independent investigations and police statements backed up Harpole. They have found no evidence of an inside conspiracy. All evidence points to a lone actor, Tyler Robinson, who held extremist anti-Kirk views as the shooter, as per the Kash Patel FBI narrative. And then, of course, we had extremes on each end. We had Candace Owens, who had a falling out with TPUSA leadership in the past. She had comments that were pointing criticism of Kirk's security team. On the other hand, former Secret Service agent Dan Bongino defended the professionalism of Kirk's security detail overall. He expressed surprise at the lapse in Utah, essentially saying he was puzzled why in this case was the roof uncovered. It was uncovered because the security team, in this case, there were two people put in charge, Dan Flood and Brian Harpole, and they both dropped the ball in verifying that day before he went out there that the roof was covered. Bongino stopped short of blaming the private guards, instead suggesting it was an unpredictable scenario. No, it wasn't, but one that future planners must anticipate. Well, we've seen this type of stuff happen already, and anyone who's in law enforcement or the FBI or CIA or any of those type of branches, they know that snipers go on the roof. So this is not something that they must anticipate in the future. They should have pre-anticipated this. This is common. I used to do security. That's one of the first things you look at is what's above you. What's the open line of sights for anyone, anywhere. And I thought this was interesting too. Rockhouse Integrity Group, Integrity Security Solutions, that is a Brian Harpole's company. This one, founded in 2022 by Brian Harpole as he departed Shaffer's company. Harpole served as CEO and lead operator based in Texas. They give his credentials, 14-year police veteran, master peace officer, all that good stuff. According to Integrity's now deleted website, so they took down their website over this, the firm offers global protective services, executive protection, risk assessments, and security consulting. So does this mean that they're out of business? Does this mean that they're just going to lay low because of what's going on? I'm actually really interested. I don't know if they're actually still functioning as a business. And then it was looking into known clients and operations. By all available accounts, Turning Point USA and Charlie Kirk in particular was the primary client of them. I'd be interested to know who else do they protect. They have all these credentials and say that they're protecting all these people internationally and doing executive protection. Is that true? Or was this kind of just like a fake website that was put up to make it look good to get the contract? Harpole had a long working relationship with Kirk. Winning TPUSA contract was a cornerstone for his startup. And of course, post-assassination, Rockhouse has a very extremely low profile. In fact, the firm seemingly scrubbed its online presence. Their official website and social media pages were taken down or made private in the weeks following the shooting. This withdrawal from the internet likely came as the company and its staff were inundated with negative attention, including conspiracy accusations and doxing, as noted above. TPUSA also removed Dan Flood's biographical page from its website around the same time. It was still live as of July 2025, but by October, it had been taken down. It's unclear if any staff changes occurred in the response, but Flood was still listed internally as a TPUSA staff member even after the incident. So just think about that. If Dan Flood was working for TPUSA in-house, he was in-house staff, and he was at that event, they basically scrubbed his existence from TPUSA's website. Why would they need to do that if there was no wrongdoing? Because everyone already knew his name. He was already listed. He'd already been publicly seen as being head of their security, and everyone knows he was there. So taking him off the website, people already knew his name, so it's not doxing. So it doesn't really make sense to remove him from the website unless he's fired or there's something going on legally and he's in trouble. I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I've been kind of racking my brain over all this security stuff, and knowing that they had this behind the scenes issue with Shaffer makes it even more interesting. Like, what actually happened behind the scenes, and is there something much more to this than what we're actually led to believe? And now with Integrity Security's site taken down, social media taken down, and now with Dan Flood also removed from TPUSA's site, what are they trying to hide? It's very strange. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And as always, like, subscribe, and share this around. And you can go in the description and see ways to support the channel. And I appreciate all you members out there. And I will see you on the next one.